Good morning, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I am Kim McCoy-Wade, Director of the California Department of Aging, and I'm thrilled once again to welcome you to our Master Plan for Aging webinar Wednesdays. This week, where we'll be focusing on transportation, and it is wonderful. We're watching the numbers rise as we, clear 50 and head towards 100 of people here with us today. So thank you so much. This is our fourth webinar in our series. Our goal is to have a two-way conversation, share information, and hear from you about your priorities for the Master Plan for Aging. Every week, we delve into a single topic, ranging from housing, homelessness, transportation, retirement security, and so much more. We always feature a state partner, a local leader, and members of our Master Plan for Aging Stakeholder Advisory Committee. This week, we've got two to present personal stories, data, programs and services, and ultimately recommendations for the master plan. Want to make sure everybody is connected easily, no registration, all information at our brand new website, engageca.org, in English and Spanish and traditional Chinese. You can always find the Zoom link. Very importantly, there'll be polls running throughout the presentation. Look for those. Feel free to answer as they run, and we'll take breaks between each speakers and share back what we're hearing from you. And don't hesitate to reach out and chat and comments if you have any issues that we can help with. Of course, all the materials, the video, and the deck will be posted after the webinar, so you have that too. Thank you so much. We just wanted to take a second to pause after going through all those logistics, just to emphasize again how important it is that we hear from you and how excited we are to be hearing from you. The first three, we've had hundreds and hundreds of comments helping us refine the recommendations that we've heard so far through our email and community recommendations and community roundtables, but also hear gaps and hear where we've missed. We have so many topics to cover the universe of aging and building an age and disability friendly California. So this is your time to speak up, and then join us on Twitter, join us on Facebook. Let's keep the dialogue going. Today, transportation. We have such an all-star lineup once again. I am thrilled for our state partner. We have Avital Bernea from our California State Transportation Agency. She's Deputy Secretary for Transportation Planning. We have John Cunningham, our local leader from Contra Costa County. And we have the dynamic duo of Debbie Toth and Clay Kemp, members of our Stakeholder Advisory Committee, who have deep experience and expertise in transportation. But before I hand the floor over to them, let's do a quick grounding in our Master Plan for Aging Foundation. This all began when our governor in June, having heard from so many of you in community forums and on the campaign trail, and as he began his administration, of the need for a Master Plan for Aging. The governor issued that executive order in June, called for a 10-year master plan, with a stakeholder advisory committee, a data-driven research committee, and a special focus on the needs of long-term services and supports. Why would he do this? Well, besides his own personal experience and hearing from all of you, the data is overwhelming. Here's a new slide we wanted to show you of the demographic trends in California. California, like the rest of the nation, is aging. These are these wonderful charts called population pyramids. If you look on your left, it's 1989. The middle one is 2019, and the right is 2049. On the bottom is the number of people who belong to each age group, starting with the youngest and then rising up to the oldest. And on the left are males, and on the right are females. So you can see in 1989, California looked like a pine tree, if you will, with a bulge around 2030, where we have folks coming to California for our campuses and our military bases, but really tapering and narrowing in the later years. By 2019, right in the rear view behind us, we're starting to look more like a pillar as more and more of us are living longer. And birth rates are falling. So you see that it's starting to look like there's as many people aging as younger. And then by 2049, look at that longevity, stretching into 80s, 90s, and 100. Tremendous opportunity there with our changing face of aging. But of course, not everyone's experience of aging is the same. Aging is really changing, and we wanted to lift up a couple of new data elements that were shared with us at our research subcommittee and will be considered also by our brand new equity work group starting next week. First and foremost, older Californians are growing more diverse, reflecting the overall trends in California towards diversity. Here's a chart from Dr. Stephen Wallace of UCLA, which shows in 2000, that 70% of older adults in California were non-Latino white, and only 13% were Latino. And those two lines are going to cross each other in around 2050. So you'll have the same number of Latino elders as white elders, and of course there are also African American, Asian American, Native American. But the trends there are reflecting, again, a diversifying California. There's other, not only do we have diversity, we also have disparities. Two looks at that quickly, just to remind us how aging is different. The next slide shows that there's inequity in disability among older Californians, with higher rates of disability for Latino older Californians and Asian older Californians, Latino 11.6% and Asian 10.4%, while African American and white are 6.8%. Similarly, economic insecurity also has disparities. And when you look at the combination of poor and near poor, not just using the federal poverty line, but looking at a broader view of economic security in California, you can see that over 40% of Latino, African American, or approximately 40% of Latino, African American, and Native American Californians over 65 are poor or near poor. Which creates a different aging opportunity and challenges than lower poverty communities like Asian and white. So in sum, aging is changing. More diversity. There's not a slide on this, but there's more of us living alone as we age. There's more at risk of poverty. And there's more awareness of the stages of aging as we live 60, 70, 80, 90. So there's so many opportunities and so many challenges as we reimagine our families, our communities, and our state. So with that, the Master Plan for Aging Stakeholder Advisory Committee got to work and laid out an ambitious vision of California for all across the lifespan, guided by values of choice, equity, dignity, inclusion and accessibility, innovation and evidence-informed, and strong partnerships. More detail about all of this framework is on our engageca.org webpage. We accepted our mission from the governor to create a person-centered, data-driven 10-year master plan for aging, with both a state plan and a local blueprint to help local communities drive their own aging goals, a data dashboard to help us all measure progress, and of course, best practice resources to help us fill in the gaps. To organize this work, because aging is everything, we have focused in 4 different goal areas, looking at services and supports so we can all live where we choose as we age and have the help we and our families need to do so. Livable communities and purpose. We will live in and be engaged in communities that are age-friendly, dementia-friendly, and disability-friendly. Health and well-being. We will live in communities and have access to services and care that optimize our health and quality of life. And economic security and safety. We will have economic security and be safe from abuse, neglect, exploitation, and natural disasters and emergencies throughout our lives. So with that ambitious framework, we have been busy. Here, the next slide shows you where we are in this timeline. We launched in June, and we are spending our fall and winter digging in to all of the policy proposals that you have, that our stakeholders have, that our committees have, to really begin to lift up and identify the biggest opportunities and biggest priorities. You'll see we're going to be getting a stakeholder report on one topic next month, really pulling it all together in the summer, synthesizing, and then by October, the administration will be releasing the master plan. So now you know where we are, where we're headed. Let's dive into transportation. I'm very pleased in particular to have this topic today be in focus. Here at CDA, where I have the privilege of being the director, we have long been involved with the Older Americans Act Supportive Services for transportation and been delighted to partner with our local area agencies on aging to fund a range of transportation services. That remains a bedrock, and at the same time, we hear from all of you how transportation is changing, just like aging. 3 trends stick out for us, and you're going to hear more about them from the real experts today. One, of course, Californians are living longer, and we're living longer than we can safely and effectively drive. So how do we continue to keep all the advantages of mobility and seeing our friends and getting to the doctor and all our volunteering and all the ways that mobility keeps us connected to our purpose if driving is not in the mix? And particularly in California, where we love our cars, what does that look like? What does it look like for mobility when we are older? Second, huge trend in California around sustainability and climate change and building communities that do get more of all of us out of our cars and have transportation options to drive sustainability. That both benefits all groups and has particular promise for older adults and persons with disabilities as we work together towards sustainable, livable communities for all. And lastly, technology is changing transportation. Rideshare and more has created new opportunities, new questions to think about how does that fit into the ecosystem of transportation options for all of us. I have been thrilled as I've traveled the state to just hear transportation in every forum I've been at. I could name off a ton, but let me just lift up three. And Nevada County, the Nevada County Transit Agency has created a golden ticket. Once you reach 80, you have a lifetime free pass on transit in Nevada County, which both, of course, encourages ridership and also offers respect for our elders. And of course, that's supported by transit orientation classes as well. LA County last year put out a very comprehensive aging and disability transportation report that I commend to you highly, looking at all a large jurisdiction, a diverse population, and many modes of transit. And of course, many of you are familiar with and might indeed be volunteers with or participants in the Village movement, which does a lot of volunteer matching of rides, a key piece of the network of transportation. So wonderful to hear about so many different strategies for transportation, and delighted to be about to turn it over to our experts. But before we do, we want to hear from you, our experts all around the state, and find out who is with us today. I'll have Adam Willoughby, our Director of Public Affairs, let us know who's here.
Great, thank you so much, Kim, and good morning to everyone on this webinar. So while Kim was making her introductory comments, we asked 3 poll questions, and I'm going to go ahead and report out on those results. And thank you again for participating in those polls and responding. So the first question that we asked: are you an interested member of the public or employed in or otherwise connected to the fields of aging or transportation? And 68% of folks indicated that they are employed or connected to the field of aging. 24% of respondents indicated they're an interested member of the public. And finally, 9% indicated that they're employed or connected to the field of transportation. The second poll that we asked, what age group do you belong to? And 23% of respondents indicated that they are between the ages of 55 and 64. 21% of respondents indicated they're between the ages of 45 and 54. And 18% of respondents indicated they're between the ages of 65 and 74. And the third and final poll that we asked you where you live in California. And so it looks like we have a tie coming in at 22% for both the Sacramento region and the San Francisco Bay Area. Second, looks like 18% of folks are tuning in from the Los Angeles area. And third looks like 16% the North Coast area. So those are the 3 polls that I'm going to report out on at this time. Thank you again for responding, and please be looking for additional polls as this webinar continues.
Great, and I'm starting to see not only poll responses, but also chats and questions. We have a question about door-to-door versus door-through-door, and I know our panelists are going to address that. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Deputy Secretary Avital Barnea to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Kim. Good morning, everyone. My name is Avital Barnea, and as mentioned, I'm the Deputy Secretary for Transportation Planning at the California State Transportation Agency. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Brian Travis, Senior Transportation Planner with the California Department of Transportation, also known as Caltrans, who is in the room with me this morning. I'm pleased to talk to you today about transportation programs and resources to serve aging Californians. I've been invited to speak to you as the state partner on the intersection of transportation and aging. The California State Transportation Agency is focusing on this issue through a variety of programs, plans for the future of transportation, and funding to support transportation operations, maintenance, and investments that will benefit all Californians, including older adults. I'll go into more detail on all of this in my presentation. Next slide, please. So what is CALSTA? The California State Transportation Agency is a relatively new agency created in 2013 to basically serve as an umbrella over the state transportation functions, which you can see here. This includes Caltrans, the California Highway Patrol, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the Office of Traffic Safety, the California High-Speed Rail Authority, the California Transportation Commission, the Board of Pilot Commissioners, and the new Motor Vehicle Board. As an agency, we help to make sure transportation functions in the state are coordinated. We are led by Secretary David Kim, who reports directly to Governor Gavin Newsom. During today's discussion, I'll mostly focus on programs and data from Caltrans, the California Highway Patrol, and the DMV. Next slide, please. One of the first things that may come to mind when you think of transportation is driving. California is a state highly dependent on driving, which can pose challenges for older adults who may be driving less or are seeing a decline in their driving skills. According to the Department of Motor Vehicles, California currently has more than 27 million licensed drivers, and more than 4.5 million of those drivers, or 17%, are age 65 or older. The stark reality is that older drivers, particularly those aged 75 and up, have higher crash death rates than drivers aged 35 to 54. The higher crash death rates among this age group are primarily due to increased vulnerability to injury in a crash. In California specifically, the Highway Patrol reports that in 2018, 558 drivers aged 65 or older were in fatal collisions, with 297 at fault. And of all California drivers killed in collisions each year, approximately 15% are 65 or older. Driving helps older adults stay mobile and independent, but driving is a complex activity that requires certain physical, visual, and cognitive abilities, and as people age, those abilities often change. These changes lead to increased risk of being injured or killed in a motor vehicle crash. But thankfully, resources exist to help older adults stay safer on the roads. Next slide, please. One such resource is a free 2-hour course offered by the California Highway Patrol called Age Well, Drive Smart. This course provides older drivers with the necessary tools to remain safe, independent, and confident on the road. Through this program, older Californians can sharpen their driving skills, refresh their knowledge of the rules of the road, and learn how to adjust to normal age-related changes. For example, the course includes a self-assessment to help older drivers identify any physical, mental, or sensory changes that may affect their ability to drive safely, such as vision or hearing loss, effects of medication on the body, and reaction time. Older drivers may not be aware of these changes, and for many, a broader awareness of the solutions rather than a focus on the problem is the key to continued safe driving. I have a true story about a woman who took the Age Well Drive Smart course. Prior to taking the course, she had gone to the DMV to renew her license and was told there that she would need to take the driving test on a computer. She was not comfortable using computers and she panicked. A family member, however, had heard of the Age Well Drive Smart course, which prepares people to go to the DMV and explains to them what may have changed since their last visit. This woman then signed up for the course, and after taking it, she no longer felt anxious about going to renew her license. In addition, from taking the self-assessment, she also decided to stop driving during certain hours of the day when she realized she may not be as safe on the road. The Age Well Drive Smart class aims to keep drivers on the road safer and for longer, but if it is time to give up your keys, the course also teaches participants about alternate modes of transportation in their area. The course is offered throughout the year at Highway Patrol area offices and other venues around the state. Last year, over 127,000 Californians took the Age Well Drive Smart course. More information is available on the Highway Patrol website, and anyone who would like to attend an Age Well Drive Smart course can sign up through their local Highway Patrol area office. Next slide, please. Another way that the California State Transportation Agency is considering older Californians is through the California Transportation Plan 2050. This is the state's long-range transportation plan that will create a vision and articulate strategic goals, policies, and recommendations to improve multimodal mobility over the next 30 years. The plan is currently under development and will be based around 8 goals, including safety, equity, quality of life and public health, accessibility, economy, environment, climate, and preservation. As we saw at the beginning of this webinar, the ratio of older adults as a proportion of the entire state population is increasing. Demographic shifts like this demonstrate the need to plan for a transportation system that serves all Californians, including older adults, and incorporates all transportation modes. For example, the California Transportation Plan 2050 is focusing on providing more sustainable forms of transportation, such as high-speed rail, transit, and walking and biking, which will form a comprehensive multimodal system that connects people to crucial destinations without necessarily having to drive. And in particular, the plan will address aging through the equity, quality of life and public health, and accessibility goals by improving access to a range of high-quality, safe, and affordable mobility options for older adults and all Californians. Next slide, please. As discussed on the previous slide, an aging state requires multimodal transportation solutions for those who cannot drive. This is a particular challenge to us in California because of how many communities have been built, what we call the transportation and land use nexus. This is a photo of the Los Angeles area, and it shows urban sprawl, a common phenomenon that poses serious complexity for Californians with limited mobility. Sprawl means large distances between home and destinations, such as the doctor's office, the grocery store, social activities, and more. And in sprawling communities, often the only way to travel these distances is to drive. This problem is actually getting worse. In fact, more communities in the state are being built in a way that makes us more dependent on driving rather than less, which can have detrimental impacts on older adults who may no longer be driving. We are keenly aware of this problem at the California State Transportation Agency and are rising to the challenge by working with other state partners that focus on housing and land use to create policies that ensure housing, jobs, and key destinations are accessible by multiple forms of transportation. In particular, the California State Transportation Agency co-leads a housing and transportation work group to make sure that transportation planning is not separated from community planning. Next slide, please. Investments in multimodal transportation to help close the land use and transportation gap are supported by a variety of state funding programs, particularly for transit, paratransit, and active transportation. To be clear, when I say transit, I mean regular, fixed-route public transportation buses and trains. Conversely, paratransit is door-to-door transportation for people with disabilities that is scheduled in advance. It's also sometimes called dial-a-ride. And active transportation generally refers to walking and biking, including sidewalks, bike lanes, and other amenities that provide for a safe and comfortable experience outside of a vehicle. Now that we understand those definitions, I'll go over a variety of sources that provide funding for these types of transportation that can benefit older adults. The most well-known of these grant programs may be the 5310 program, called Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities, which provides funding for accessible vans, buses, and related equipment, and operating assistance and mobility management of paratransit. The purpose of these grants are to improve mobility for older adults and individuals with disabilities by removing barriers to transportation services and expanding transportation mobility options. Caltrans solicits applications for 5310 funding every 2 to 3 years, with $33 million available for the next round of grants. It's important to note that the demand for the funding exceeds the amount of available money, however, but this provides an opportunity for partners and counties to help fill the gap, as we will hear about later in this webinar. I'd like to focus on the mobility management aspect of these grants, which can fund travel training programs to increase individuals' awareness, knowledge, and skills to take public transportation. One funding recipient for this purpose is Nevada Sierra Connecting Point, and we will play a short video of how their grant-supported travel training has made a positive difference in the life of an older adult. Nelson, would you please play the video?
I recently gave up driving because I felt inadequate. I wasn't making good decisions and I didn't want to hurt anybody or get hurt. So one day, out of the blue, I said to my daughter, the last day of this year is the last day of driving. My name is Mary Miller, and this is my travel training story. My favorite place to go on the bus, on Tuesday morning they have a farmer's market. The travel training has taught me that you can be independent. The bus drivers are there to help you. Everything is simple, easy. I think the bus drivers in this city are special people. Travel training taught me to take the bus. I turned from being a frightened little old lady to being more self-assured and being able to do what I needed to do.
Great. So you can see from that video that Mary learned how to use the bus in her local community through travel training, which gave her confidence and independence. These kinds of travel training programs are available to you all over the state and continue to be supported by the 5310 funding program. Next slide, please. In addition, we have other transportation grant programs funded through Senate Bill 1, the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, which is the state's landmark transportation investment. These include the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, which provides grants for intercity, commuter, and urban rail systems, and bus and ferry transit systems. Through 3 previous rounds of funding, the California State Transportation Agency has awarded over $5.3 billion through the program to 56 transformative projects throughout the state. And under Governor Newsom and Secretary Kim, new program guidelines focus on the importance of housing around transit projects, as well as considering how the project would contribute direct benefits to disadvantaged communities that need it the most. In addition, the State Rail Assistance Program funds intercity rail and commuter rail service expansion and operations. Since 2018, over $77 million from this program has been awarded to projects that expand rail service. One funding recipient is the Altamont Corridor Express, which through its grant was able to initiate train service on Saturdays and Sundays when previously trains only ran during the week. Another SB1 program is the Active Transportation Program, which funds projects that encourage increased use of active modes of transportation, such as walking and biking. This grant program provides $100 million annually to communities for the construction of facilities to increase walking and biking, as well as educational efforts related to active transportation. Similarly to the travel training program, these educational initiatives can be useful to older Californians who are looking for safe ways and routes to travel by foot, bike, scooter, or wheelchair. Next slide, please. In addition, the State Transit Assistance Program provides $250 million annually to transit agencies for capital infrastructure and operational costs. This can include the purchase of buses or adding additional transit service which improves mobility for transit users. Relatedly, the State of Good Repair Program provides $105 million annually to maintain or repair existing transit fleets and facilities, or to purchase new vehicles or facilities that improve existing transit service. An example project funded by the State of Good Repair Program is an $87,000 grant to the County of Tehama to rehabilitate the Red Bluff Transit Transfer Center to bring the facility into compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Grant monies are being used to upgrade sidewalks and curbing and repair striping in the parking area, as well as other ADA facility upgrades. And the last grant program I'd like to talk about is the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. This is one of several programs that are part of the Transit, Affordable Housing, and Sustainable Communities program established by Senate Bill 862 in 2014. This program provides funding to transit agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through new or expanded bus or rail services, intermodal transit facilities, or operating assistance with a priority on serving disadvantaged communities. In 2018, 152 projects received nearly $97 million in funding from the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, with 87% of that funding specifically benefiting disadvantaged and low-income California communities. This includes a $2 million grant to MetroLink in Southern California to offer over 80,000 free tickets for targeted populations, including new transit riders and those over the age of 65. That concludes my presentation on the transportation programs and resources that the California State Transportation Agency is providing to serve an aging population. I hope this has been informative, and I look forward to your questions. All right, Jen or Kim or Nelson? We can't hear you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Avital, for your presentation. Kim and Adam, are you on the phone and ready to go over some polls?
For the warm handoff. We're going to respond. Adam's going to go through the poll response, and then I will share back all the questions and comments that are rolling in. So here we go, Adam.
Yes, thank you so much. So during Avital's presentation, we asked 3 additional polls. Thank you for responding to those. I'm going to go ahead and report out on those. So the first one that we asked, what modes of transportation do you typically use? And with the resounding 83% of respondents indicated that they drive themselves. Second, coming in at 7%, indicated that they use conventional public transportation. And then there were a number of others, each at 2%, including bicycle, walking, and other.
And Adam, we just have to say, we also got a shout out in the chat for skateboarding and ferries. Next question. Golf carts. Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. Golf carts too.
So the second question we asked, are you familiar with California Highway Patrol's Age Well, Drive Smart course? 60% of respondents indicated that this is the first time that they had heard of it. Coming in at second with 28%, indicating that they have heard of it before. 7% of folks indicated they have not participated, and 5% indicated that they have participated. And the third and final poll that we asked if you regularly use public transit, for example, bus, trains, subways, etc. 78% of respondents indicated that they did not, and 22% of respondents indicated that they did.
Yes, and a couple of the comments about why not had to do with convenience and location near work. The question we asked you open-ended was, do you have a plan if or when you stop driving? And we got wonderful diversity of comments I'd love to share with you. One of our respondents said, yes, I am fortunate to live in a very transit-rich area. A shout out for fare discounts and also the importance of Saturday service, that it not just be based on the traditional workday rush hour schedule. So transit's an important part. Lynette, in fact, said she intends to move and downsize to be closer to transit as she ages. Sheila says she intends to walk as much as possible. So already right now, she is walking a considerable amount so that continues to be a viable option. Other folks are imagining getting rides from agencies like Wise and Healthy Aging in Los Angeles. and the Westside Pacific Village Movement, who apparently have used those wonderful 5310 funds to purchase a van and share it for things like trips to adult day centers, grocery stores, and other destinations during the day. Other folks talk about they're already using rideshare and expect to use rideshare. And then we had some very future forward looking. Judy talks about the continued innovation in automotive safety. The lights that flash when a car is close to you or help you park, the automotive safety technology will make it possible to drive longer and safer. And Bill is already there and says fully autonomous vehicles will be part of the plan for mobility when aging. One other theme has come up repeatedly in the questions, which is don't forget rural communities. We've heard a little bit about Nevada and Tehama in the remarks so far, and I know that's kind of a perfect segue to introduce John from Contra Costa, because Contra Costa is one of those counties that has urban, rural, and suburban. And of course, John Cunningham, as a statewide leader, can speak to that some as well. So again, John, I'll hand it off to you for your remarks.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, this is John Cunningham. I'm a transportation planner in Contra Costa County. For those who aren't familiar with the region, Contra Costa is in the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area. Next slide, please. So a bit of professional background and context, not as a self-indulgent or get to know your webinar presenter exercise, but I wanted to pass along some insight into the disparities of how the accessible segment of the transportation system is handled relative to other transportation planning areas that I've been involved in. So I began working at a transportation agency providing Americans with Disabilities Act paratransit for older adults and persons with disabilities. I'm going to provide an overview of that operation here in a bit. After that role, I shifted to a more typical jack of all trades type of transportation planner, working on bicycle pedestrian projects, traffic impact studies, that sort of thing. This type of job transition is pretty uncommon. Accessible transit is very specialized, even within the public transit industry. The point I wanted to make is there isn't really much crossover between all the different transportation subsets. So accessible transit sort of operates on its own out there. This transition has allowed me to see a vast disparity in how transportation for older persons and individuals with disabilities differs from the general public. Moving on, we need to provide a definition here. Accessible transit is an umbrella term that encompasses an array of functions, some of which we're going to talk about here in a bit: mobility management, travel training, city programs, volunteer driver programs, that sort of thing. However, the core of accessible transit is paratransit. And paratransit is sometimes called dial-a-ride service, and it takes you from a unique location to another unique location, home to shopping, home to dialysis, that sort of thing. The service can be door-to-door, but the Americans with Disabilities Act requirement is only curb-to-curb, meaning they'll either drop you at the curb and you find your way to the door of your final destination, or somebody escorts you to the door. Next slide, please. So introduction and definitions aside, here's what I'm going to present to you. I'm going to define the problem with accessible transportation systems and policies. I already gave you a bit of a glimpse when I mentioned the discussion of disparities. I'm going to describe a specific agency operation that was well regarded and award-winning, and quick spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. And then I wanted to talk about replicating the best practices in a systemic statewide manner. First, we'll talk about the barriers, and then we'll talk about the opportunities, and there's plenty of both. Next slide, please. So let's get into it here. The problem is the fact that accessible transportation services for older adults and persons with disabilities is a fairly poorly performing segment of the transportation system. Now, disclaimer, I'm going to make some generalizations. There are some agencies and localities providing excellent service. I'm describing the lack of a statewide systemic structure to encourage and support successful operations. So this is a poorly performing segment of the transportation system. It's not a controversial position, and it's not unique to California. It's universal, frankly. I'm saying the quiet part out loud here. It's an open secret that decision makers have been grappling with this for quite some time. With typical transportation planning and public finance issues, road building for cars, bicycle pedestrian projects, and other large capital projects like passenger rail extensions or bridges, a need is identified, and it's not universal, but generally speaking, the funding is secured if the need is great enough. It's not complete or immediate, but progress actually happens. It plugs along. If you want a demonstration, at least in the Bay Area, we have numerous BART rail extensions either in operation or underway. There are green bike lanes for cyclists popping up everywhere, and we have a toll lane system being installed around the Bay Area. Love them or hate them, they do improve freeway operations. So there's no such progress in service for older adults and persons with disabilities. It has become stagnant with incremental improvements at best. This stagnation is really unique. It impacts a sensitive population, and it has been allowed to continue for quite some time. So this has been the case for, and I'm not exaggerating here, decades. And I guess next slide, please. I had some studies up on the slide. There are numerous studies that have been conducted by federal, state, and local agencies. And we're talking dozens of studies. And keep in mind, these studies aren't looking at different aspects of the service. They're studying the same thing pretty much over and over and over again. In my own home jurisdiction, Contra Costa County, we have completed 3 studies over the last 30 years. None of the recommendations have been implemented, and we're conducting a 4th study now. So moving away from the problem to a bright spot. Outreach Paratransit was a mobility management operation that provided service on behalf of the Santa Clara County public transit provider. It provided a continuum of services that were available at one location, one phone number, one website, no wrong door. It really was, it was a rider-focused system. So the core of the service that we provided was ADA paratransit service. As I mentioned before, this is unique location to unique location, home to shopping, home to friends, that sort of thing. However, it was also a mobility management and a brokerage operation. This essentially means matching passengers with the most appropriate travel mode, be it taxi, a Lyft-equipped vehicle, or car sharing services such as Lyft or Uber. And we also provided travel training. I believe Avital mentioned this during her presentation. We taught folks how to use conventional bus and rail services, which also happens to improve costs. So also in the back end, and this particular function the importance can't be understated, the financial services and administration function. This is incredibly complex and warrants an entire presentation, but this part of the operation has the ability to aggregate and organize funding streams on behalf of clients and other agencies. You could then cost allocate on behalf of all parties. This is no small task when you're talking about commingling passengers on trips. This type of financial management capacity also enabled the management of rider subsidies, which also resulted in encouraging people to provide subsidies. For example, a city has a program to transport their residents, no problem. A city would provide outreach to funding, and we would distribute appropriately. A certain foundation or nonprofit would provide funding for, say, visually impaired clients, no problem. Funds would be collected, applied to the appropriate client account, records would be kept for auditing and accounting, one-stop shop, no wrong door, seamless and convenient. So this system is functionally the same as, now bear with me here, this gets a bit wonky, as mobility on demand or mobility as a service type systems. Now these are new systems being developed for able-bodied people. There's so many modes available now: bus, electric scooter, bike share, Lyft, Uber, rail, that they're sort of reconfiguring a paratransit brokerage type system for able-bodied people. And then, they just put the MOD or MOS label on it. But these systems have been around for decades, despite not being widely deployed because they are frankly complex and expensive to get up and running. So back to Outreach Paratransit, the result of all this functionality was a rider-centered system, no wrong door, and that resulted in, next slide please. It was an award-winning system, frankly. The Community Transportation Association of America gave Outreach its first Mobility Management Award. CTAA is the primary national advocacy organization for this type of transportation. The Federal Transit Administration, in their most recent comprehensive study of this field, identified this operation as a best practice. But let's talk about costs. Next slide, please. So in addition to the depth and quality of service came a cost savings. The chart shows the difference over time as technology improved and operations were refined. Cost per trip actually dropped in the coordinated system. This is unheard of in this field. In the uncoordinated system, you can see the costs rise. However, I mentioned a spoiler earlier, this agency still exists, but a number of the functions we talked about are no longer in place in their entirety. Some of the funding and contracts were eliminated in a rather unconventional manner. And this speaks to the vulnerable nature of these operations, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Even highly regarded operations are not immune from undermining, politics, and ongoing turf battles. The policy and funding landscape needs to change if we are to see progress. Next slide, please. So, why is improving the accessible transportation field so difficult? Why is this problem so intractable, and why are we stuck in this cycle of study, analyze, stagnate, study, analyze, stagnate? The biggest reason is really that there are no robust supportive policies or revenue stream. The previous example made it clear, even with a successful operation, there's no solid policy foundation or likelihood of survival. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my closing statement. It's only by chance that there are successes. We need to eliminate the chance and make it policy. Imagine if solving commute congestion issues were left to chance. Half-hour commutes would be 3 hours. One of the other problems is an array of providers, both the number and the type. Services provided by public agencies, nonprofits, cities, counties, health plans, all have different philosophies, expertise, funding, requirements, and authority. But herding cats would be a vast improvement. And with all those providers, there's no single responsible leader identified. There's a vacuum. And in addition, this is a technically complex service to provide and administer. And when I say complex, I just mean resource intensive. I talked a bit about that in the financial services discussion, but bear with me here. The complexity includes dynamic vehicle routing, sensitive passenger population, varying vehicle types, the need to adhere to ADA onboard time restrictions, the need to cost allocate across different revenue streams, the commingling of different passengers with different eligibility. It takes a very sophisticated entity to competently run this type of organization. So the first 4 bullets are pretty solvable problems. The next 2 are a bit trickier because they are actually suggested as a solution when in fact they really aren't. And one of the biggest buzzwords in the accessible transit field is coordination. I'm going to highlight a study with that word in a bit here, but the truth is recommending coordination without supportive policies or revenues is really the thoughts and prayers of the accessible transportation world. It's meaningless. And then the next one is technology, and it really consumes a lot of attention. We heard a bit about that earlier, and I see in the comments. Technology is growing in the transportation field. There's a lot of new mobility options popping up, and autonomous vehicles are very popular. They're being discussed quite a bit. Now, don't get me wrong, they're coming. It's just a matter of when. However, assurances that autonomous vehicles will help in the accessible transit field seem a bit disingenuous considering that we have existing technologies and systems that would help, but they aren't being implemented. The elephant in the room. Next slide, please. So the elephant in the room really is politics. Institutions resist change. My apologies for pointing out the obvious, but this is a real problem. No, the politics problem is so acute that the Transit Cooperative Research Program, which is an arm of the National Academy of Sciences, produced the report that you see there on your screen. Even they have coordinating there in the title. Now, this organization is a public policy think tank for transportation. They're nerds, frankly, they're geeks. They do technical studies. They have economists, analysts, engineers, and the first problem they identified with making improvements in this area was politics. And they entitled the section of the report, just as you see it there on the slide, politics, politics, politics. Next slide, please. So the good news is that there are existing mechanisms in place that we can pick up and use fairly quickly. There's a very limited need for additional studies or, in a wholesale fashion, development of new statutory language. Some of the existing mechanisms, both policy and revenue, are on this page. Really, frankly, we have the luxury of knowing what the solutions are, and I'll talk about that in a second. These mechanisms and the advocacy to implement them all have to be robust enough to overcome the politics barrier in the previous slide. It's no small feat. There needs to be a critical mass to overcome the institutional resistance to change. Now, the first bullet that you see there is Consolidated Transportation Services Agency, or CTSA. So CTSA is a designation in state law that's been around since 1979 that came about with the passage of AB 120, which is a Social Services Transportation Act. The idea with the CTSA model was to foster coordination among social service transportation providers in order to better utilize existing transportation resources. The CTSA designation is often applied to nonprofit agencies, although other types of agencies are eligible for the designation. Now, there have already been several planning efforts at the state, I mentioned them earlier, that have already recommended expanding CTSA authority and providing real funding. You're going to hear a subsequent presenter, I think, mention CTSAs. So the next few bullets, these are all existing revenue streams that could be enhanced or tweaked to finally engender some progress in this field, this accessible transit field. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. In addition to an improved system providing reduced cost and improved service, it also typically just happens to result in a reduction of greenhouse gases, which would make this service eligible for that funding stream. 5310, you heard Avital discuss this a bit earlier. It's a federal funding program administered at the state level called the Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities. I think you'll hear a subsequent presenter talk about this program too. So in short, it needs reform. Allocation decisions really need to be closer to the local level. Decisions made at the state level for service that is frankly only really understood at the local level, it doesn't make much sense, and it does create problems. Now, don't get me wrong, the 5310 program has had many successes, and it helps a lot of people. A substantial amount of support is out there in the community from the 5310 program, but it does need some tweaking. So the Transportation Development Act review process that's underway in the general fund, those are wide open fields that really require a dedicated conversation. Just suffice to say, there are opportunities there if we want to take advantage of it. And then late breaking news, Assembly Bill 2057, the Bay Area Seamless Transit Act, was announced with some fanfare yesterday. It intends on seamlessly integrating the 27 transit operators in the 9-county Bay Area region. Now, accessible transit service for older Californians and those with disabilities aren't expressly excluded, but they aren't expressly included either. So we're going to need to see if the needs of older adults and those with disabilities ends up being segregated from the benefits of this legislation here as it moves ahead. And I think we should keep an eye on that. So in closing, the commonalities that we see in successful consolidated transportation service agency nonprofits are a strong, charismatic, influential leader that has somehow managed to cobble together local support and revenue in an unsupportive policy environment. Now, that's great for those operations. However, we shouldn't be relying on a superhero to show up to fix the problem. It's not good public policy, and it's shown to be unsustainable. I'm hoping that the Master Plan on Aging process will act as a catalyst to finally implement a more appropriate and resilient policy solution. And that ends my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. We are going to do a quick poll recap, and then John and Avital, we do have some clarifying questions for you before we turn it over to our SAC members. Adam.
Great. So thank you very much. During John's presentation, we asked 4 polls, and I'm going to go ahead and report out on those. If you use public transit, either paratransit or conventional bus or rail, what are some of your typical destinations? Coming in with 44%, respondents indicated their destination was work. Second place with 32% respondents indicated their destination was medical or dental appointments. Third at 28% was to visit friends or family. And finally at 20%, respondents indicated grocery and household shopping stores. And our next poll that we asked, we said, if you use paratransit or dial-a-ride type service, how often do you use this service? We had a tie, both at 40%, folks indicated once a month or less than once a month. And then at 20%, folks indicated that they use these types of services once a week. In our third poll that we asked, if you use paratransit or dial-a-ride type service, how would you describe your satisfaction? 57% of respondents indicated that they were neutral, and both coming in at 29% was somewhat dissatisfied or dissatisfied. And the fourth poll that we asked, if you use car share services such as Uber or Lyft, how would you describe your satisfaction? 47% of respondents indicated that they were satisfied. 28% of respondents indicated that they were somewhat satisfied. And 22% of respondents indicated neutral. So thank you again for responding to those polls, and please be looking for more.
Great. Now we will take a few questions for our speakers before turning it over to our Stakeholder Advisory Committee members. Deputy Secretary Avital Barnea, there's been a lot of questions about the data you shared, so I appreciate in our chatting you have offered to follow up to this webinar with some more data about the number of drivers over 65, but also the miles driven by people over 65, and some more information about accidents and fatalities. So that'll be a great follow-up item. The question I'm hoping you can speak to now is the number of questions about rural communities. How are rural communities able to benefit, and how are some of the barriers with some of the programs that you described from the state?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kim. And I will get back on those numbers about the crash deaths. For the rural question, I'd like to turn that over to my colleague, Brian Travis, who's the rural expert.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian. The rural question is a tough nut to crack. There's always going to be limited funding, and I think that's something that everybody who's listening knows. But the 5310 program is a program that rural communities can apply to. I strongly encourage the RTPAs and the MPOs to develop strong coordinated plans in the rural communities so that their projects that they're putting forward compete well in the program. The LC Top program is another program that's an eligible program for rural communities. The 5311 program is our regional apportionment to rural communities. So, you know, essentially it's about engagement. I think if there's more engagement and if there's more coordination amongst the partners at the local level, rural communities that stand up and have their voices heard tend to do better.
And that 5311 program is specifically for rural?
Yeah, it's a rural regional apportionment that every county gets here in California for fixed route public transportation.
Thank you. A couple questions for John Cunningham, the Principal Transportation Planner from Contra Costa County. John, a quick one. What was that bill number again? People were very excited to hear about that.
Oh, that was AB 2057.
From David Chu, correct?
That is correct. It's the Bay Area Seamless Transit Act.
Great. One request for follow-up homework for you. If you are aware of other states who have done good work in this area, we highlighted the great state of Los Angeles's plan on this earlier, but if you are aware from your national perspective of other states, we would love to get those plans and share those plans as part of our resource kit. So a request for homework, if you don't mind.
No problem.
And then another question is if you could help us make the link to housing. Our webinar last week was about housing, and of course the Governor's Strategic Growth Council is always about housing and transportation. Certainly the age-friendly community vision from World Health Organization has housing and transportation. So what happens when you see all this housing going up in many communities? How is transportation figured into that to make those places where people can live and have access to alternative transportation than a car?
Well, it's an important question, and yeah, it's so important, in fact, that a lot of transportation professionals work on housing a big part of the time, and a lot of it really comes down to density. In order to make public transit effective, you need higher density housing, and that, you know, when you have a spread out suburban type of environment, it's very difficult to run an effective, efficient transit service. So, you know, building housing is important for a whole variety of reasons that are in the news right now. But just through the transportation lens, it's important to have housing that's higher density, and it's, you know, more centrally located, I guess is one way to put it. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you. Many other questions have come in. I know that some of them are going to be addressed by our next speakers. A couple people are asking about how insurance works for these volunteer driver networks. So I know Debbie is able to speak to that. And also people are asking, how can we speak to active transportation and aging? What is the real connection that is possible as we age to the active transportation? So I'll leave those out there and know that we will address them in the next comments. Or we'll pick them up in our last question and polling session. Before I hand it off to our Stakeholder Advisory Committee members, I just want to, we are also getting feedback from other expert places. We are so lucky that we have Clay and Debbie on our Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and I'll introduce them properly in a second. We also have a research subcommittee where we're honored to have David Ragland of the Berkeley Safe Transportation Research and Education Center advising as well. And then again, our new Master Plan for Aging Equity Work Group begins next week, and we'll be looking at all recommendations for an equity lens, particularly around race, ethnicity, language, and immigration, as well as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender plus communities, and inclusion and equity from all perspectives. So to kick off our recommendation section, I'm thrilled to introduce our first Stakeholder Advisory Committee member, Clay Kemp, who is the Executive Director of the Senior Council, the area agency on aging serving Santa Cruz County. Clay.
Thanks, Kim. And just to cover everything, we actually serve San Benito County as well as Santa Cruz.
Apologies. Yes, indeed.
No worries. So I want to echo a lot of what John was saying about CTSAs. And in a former career, I ran a CTSA. So everything he was saying really resonated with me a lot. And I've encouraged people to look up that model. A number of years ago, my dear friend Linda Devins, who used to be the director of the CTSA in Sacramento County, actually wrote an ebook on what a CTSA is, can, and should do, and some of the processes you might go for. And I think that's on the California Association for Coordinated Transportation website. So that would be something or a resource to look at if you want to do some more work in this area. For me, my presentation is going to address mainly what we have been seeing in the feedback that has been received online or in writing on Master Plan on Aging. And then Debbie Toth will talk about some of the specific goals that we have moving forward. Ultimately, we will put together those comments and all the comments and recommendations from here and the response to the polls as a recommendation to go forth to the Master Plan for Aging. But we did not want to do that without hearing all of your feedback because we think it's a critical piece of this. So just to start on the things we've seen, so we should go to the next slide. I really tried to look at some of the themes, and we're hearing them today, and just, you know, look at what showed up over and over or was really an innovative approach to some of these challenges. So the first one has come up a couple times, and that is, you know, just the method of specialized transportation. Should it be curb to curb, or should it be door to door, or should it be door through door? And I think there are a lot of stereotypes about what each of those things are and how much more or less they cost to do. but there has not been meaningful analysis of each. And personally, I feel that too often in paratransit models, for example, curb to curb is the system designed because that's the minimum standard that's required. And the argument is made that it saves money versus door to door. Does it really save money, and how much does it save? And in my opinion, it saves money by being a barrier to the service. If somebody has to go curb to curb, and let's say they have dementia, that really eliminates paratransit as an option for them to use. So that's an inherent problem that's really kind of a manufactured barrier. So we need to address those. Same day service versus advanced registration. People have asked that question numerous times. And I think when a lot of these systems were created back in the 90s, advanced registration was absolutely required just because of limited technology. But in the 20, 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, technology has come up to speed much more sophisticated than it was back in the early days. So systems actually track where vehicles are, and it's relatively easy to add same-day service, at least in a partial level, to all paratransit services. Next slide. A couple things that resonated a lot with me was age disability friendly transit design. And what we see sometimes is just systems that don't realize that paratransit or specialized transportation or dial-a-ride are the last available options for a number of users. So that needs to be probably more heavily weighted than it often is in terms of designs of these systems. Another emerging issue is the Uber and Lyft or car share services, the impact or the availability of wheelchair users to ride in that system. And historically, when taxi companies were kind of the name of the game for demand response service, for immediate service, while there were pros and cons to taxi services, one thing that was developed in a lot of areas were basically subsidies to make sure that taxis operated wheelchair equipped or wheelchair accessible vehicles 24/7. So with taxis being replaced by more personalized service, that availability of wheelchair services is really being compromised. And one of the things I think we need to focus on is how can we recreate some public-private partnerships to highlight the usage of taxi-like vehicles or Uber and Lyft to provide taxi-type services that are accessible. Next slide. Walkable design in each city. Active transportation sometimes is designed very poorly just by some of the end users or by box stores or neighboring rivals. For example, in many communities, you'll see grocery stores that are located adjacent to one another, and neither store wants to have folks that's in one parking lot get over to the next parking lot. So what do? They create a barrier between the two stores so that not only can you not drive from one parking lot to the other, but you can't walk from one parking lot to another unless you make a large detour out to the main street and then come back. And that's a very unfriendly design, both for walkability and for people with disabilities and older adults. In a similar vein, if we look at those types of stores, fixed route transit may be present, but usually you get dropped off at the curb and then there's a large parking lot which you have to navigate cars driving erratically in order to get the store. And if you're a person whose mobility is compromised, trying to carry your groceries through that parking lot after you've shopped and then back out to the sidewalk to pick up the bus is a huge disincentive to those services. Free fixed route was mentioned numerous times in here to provide people who are ADA eligible free rides on fixed transit anytime they wish. Also looking at off-peak hours for seniors or people with disabilities to be able to ride for free, when commuters aren't currently on the bus. It's a nice introduction to public transit and a motive for getting there. And then lastly, and probably the most common comment, most frequent comment, was lack of transportation services in rural areas. And what do we do about it? And this is maybe the most challenging solution we have out there. The resources aren't available in rural areas, but often the distance of the ride that somebody needs to take is longer than it is in a more densely populated area. So how do you compromise those two? And one idea that I think is really excellent is, and low cost, is just the expansion of volunteer driver programs, which was another comment that we often saw through the survey. So in areas where there are limited resources but more critical need, there's also a lack of resources to create volunteer programs, and that is very cost effective and just effective in terms of getting rides out to people to explore that. And I think that's a place that rural communities could just tremendously benefit from. Lastly, to wrap up, I'm going to hand it off to Debbie, but there's a couple things that I need to throw out there. How we measure transportation effectiveness is part of our problem. We need to see the impact of rides rather than the number of rides provided. Also, in terms of ADA paratransit design, ADA paratransit is far too often designed about what's the minimum service you can provide, and I don't think fixed route would ever see that. So just turning inside out how we measure transportation systems to make them more effective and more user-friendly is not done through any systemic model by which the funding flows. And it's time to really start rethinking what an effective transportation service is and what an efficient transportation model is. So with that, I'll turn it over to Debbie Toth, and she's going to talk about some of the solutions to these challenges.
Thank you, Clay. I just want to put a little caveat out there. I'm sitting right next to our adult day healthcare program, so if you hear jovial people interacting in activities, that's what you're hearing. Hi, everyone. I am thrilled to be examining one of the greatest opportunities we have to ensure we can navigate in our lives and our communities as we age, transportation. I'm Debbie Toth. I've had the honor of working with older adults more than half of my life and have found our lack of a person-centered transportation system to be one of the greatest challenges in ensuring folks can live in their setting of choice on their terms. So we've heard from the state about a variety of programs that address various pieces of increased mobility for seniors and persons with disabilities, but we also heard that they have insufficient funding, and we need opportunities for implementing uniform best practices. We also heard from our local leader, John Cunningham, a colleague of mine, that a coordinated and comprehensive system of person-centered accessible mobility options can exist and can, in time, improve rider outcomes, increase supply, and reduce the per-trip cost. But we cannot continue to study and plan and study and plan. In case you didn't hear him say that, I'm repeating it. We have systems in place, such as the CTSA, that can be funded and allow for these systems to engage now. And I would like to point out that in the webinar chat, John gave a link so that people can read more about CTSAs if they want to. But we need to have a coordinated effort with funding and standardized best practices for implementation. And I'm going to get more into that a little bit later. And then we've just heard from Clay, my colleague who was on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and he summarized the external feedback we've received to date on transportation and painted a picture of why those comments are coming in and where they're coming from. And I hope that you are beginning to get the sense that the feedback is being listened to, incorporated, and part of the planning process. So I think that's it's incredible that the Department of Aging has the leadership to be able to bring in all this feedback and incorporate it into the process. Next slide. I think I just did the content summary there. Before diving into the recommendations, I think it's important to expand the conversation beyond services and look at access, or actually lack of access, to services. There are a variety of populations who have barriers to accessing services, and we must include this in our lens as we formulate our plan. So, for example, we know that compared to heterosexual cisgender adults, LGBT older adults have fewer options for informal care. They are more likely to be single or living alone and less likely to have children to care for them than non-LGBT elders. And this obviously impacts transportation because many folks also have networks within their families who drive them. There are lifetime disparities in earnings, employment, and opportunities to build savings, as well as discriminatory access to legal and social programs that are traditionally established to support aging adults. So people can't afford necessarily transportation options. Think about the cost of a Lyft or an Uber and whether or not you'd be able to do that in the absence of having a job. So there are disparities in access, there's disparity in income. Beyond the LGBTQ community, race plays a role. And we saw earlier when Kim was presenting and setting up the stage for us to talk about this, that we see that race plays a role in access to services. We also see an increased rate of disability, and we also see that there are impacts related to poverty. Language plays a role. What language you speak, how you access the information, how do people know who don't speak English that we have alternate transportation options? Where you live plays a role. The mobility devices you use play a role. So there are so many different factors that we need to ensure that we include when we're building this system of integrated transportation and mobility. So let's look at rural, because that has come up in the chatter a lot today, and also in our feedback. Rural transportation issues are real and vastly different than urban. So there are roads that a paratransit vehicle cannot travel. There are places with no Uber or Lyft. There are people whose mobility devices do not allow the use of taxis. The Uber or Lyft cannot accommodate those. And even volunteer driver programs, they don't exist everywhere. So there are also rural areas, as we learned in our last Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting, that don't even have cell service or signal. So there are unique challenges to mobility in rural areas that absolutely must be addressed in this plan. And in an urban system, we think it has it all. In Contra Costa County, if somebody needs to get from Richmond to Antioch, which is maybe 15 miles, they could experience a 6-hour one-way trip with 3 different paratransit providers. Separate joint powers agreements in a county system of regional transportation areas that created these artificial boundaries have inadvertently created a nightmare for riders who utilize paratransit. Can you imagine being incontinent or having dementia and navigating 6 hours with 3 different buses, 3 different drivers, and a ton of different people getting on and off those shared rides? It's the epitome of not being person-centered. So just because something is offered, just because a service is available doesn't mean it's the right service. Next slide. It's pretty clear that our system is not working for older adults. And in order to achieve a true California for all, it needs to. We mustn't build systems that try to fit people into them. We must acknowledge that systems only work when they are built to meet the needs of the users of that system. When done well, as we learned from John's example, a coordinated system that is centered around older adult users can increase mobility, rider satisfaction, and reduce costs. So we need to build policies and financing structures that ensure this paradigm is supported. And they must be flexible, allowing for best practices and innovation. And I'm not talking about beam me up Scotty kind of innovation, although I don't think we'd say no to that. I am talking about regulatory flexibility with person-centered piloting. We did this at our adult day healthcare program, where we took a hybrid of the Lyft with paratransit model. Vehicles are scheduled with 3 riders. They do 2 round trips. The drivers have the same training as the paratransit drivers. They're drug screened. So we kind of put these 2 models together, and those vehicles only have 3 people in them. They're scheduled trips, and they can riders can utilize wheelchairs, walkers, etc. We need more of this and less battling to get funding streams to pay for the status quo. I'm particularly fond of the way a research paper on elder-centered mobility policy sets the stage for the kind of work we believe we need to embark on in California. Please bear with me as I read the intro to you from a paper written in Portugal for presentation at the World Conference on Transport Research in 2016. Please note the grammar may not be perfect, but listen to what they're including when they're setting the stage for creating a plan. Quote, "This paper reflects the aging process as a normal and universal transformation. The physical and cognitive limitations when faced with a mobility system that is not adapted to the reality of the elders, in which facts must be considered in a possible restructuring of the system in order to promote the quality of life of the elderly, access to goods, opportunities, and social groups, providing them with the necessary empowerment to independently fulfill their needs. Improved mobility is not just a set directive, but rather a process of multidisciplinary collaboration and coordination with other urban policies and projects such as health, infrastructure, and land use, so that it serves the objectives and needs of the population, promotes security for all its citizens, reflects community values, and supports the activities already under development, and fosters community sustainability. The objectives described will have a positive impact on economic vitality, stimulates the development of land use, and promotes a healthier lifestyle and improved interconnectivity between activities." Now, that's the end of that quote. I think that beautifully articulates the framework within which we need to create a truly seamless, coordinated system of mobility for older adults. So finally, next slide, as for what will be included in our recommendations, think about the fact that in the last century, we've added 3 decades to our life expectancy. We must recognize that we've added 3 decades of life expectancy and have not created a plan for how we get around in those 3 decades. So it's not just about the most frail and paratransit and alternate mobility options for that, but it's from the time that we retire until the time that we do need those more increased services. There must be a pathway and a continuum of transportation options. Currently, our system, our transportation system, our housing system, everything, our parks, our everything is built around a healthy 32-year-old white person. And we need to do different and we need to do better. So the master plan for aging must create a coordinated transportation continuum that reflects the aging continuum, accounting for inequities in access to appropriate and affordable mobility services. The plan must include funding and a policy framework for state, local, private, and public entities to work together to implement best practices within existing structures such as CTSA. At a minimum, it must include, next slide, access for all who need it, a system for transitioning from driving to utilizing alternate mobility options, training in travel and mobility options, improved fixed route services with Lyft and trained drivers, improved paratransit services, including door-through-door and door-to-door. That was one of the chatter comments. Volunteer driver programs, taxi voucher programs, social service provider transportation programs, Uber and Lyft-like options for people using wheelchairs, accessible road, sidewalk entries and exits to services. So I do want to say on the volunteer driver program, there was a question about that. There are grants and there are funding streams that help support those programs. And there are reduced cost insurance for that, and there's a ton of research that you can read at the National Center for Mobility Management and also on the National Conference of State Legislatures. There's a bunch of info on that. So in summary, meaningful iterative data must inform how we shape the plan through its implementation and course correct and adapt through future years. And we're hoping to get your feedback and incorporate it more, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Poll group is voting on their top recommendations. Adam, what's that poll result? Lots of votes coming in. It's great. I want to also thank all of you who are commenting and questioning, and to our panelists who are nimbly responding. We got a great question about airports, which we haven't talked about, and Avital was able to answer that, and the a participant who's from UCSF working on mobility and dementia friendly at SFO were able to connect. So thank you all for being so interactive in real time. Adam, poll result.
Great, thank you. So during Clay's and Debbie's presentation, we asked a couple of polls. The first was, if you use public transit, either paratransit or conventional bus or rail, what's the top barrier or challenge that you typically face? 33% of respondents indicated that there's no public transit near me or my destination. Coming in at second place with 25%, respondents indicated that during the time I would like to travel, for example, night or weekends, there's limited or no service. And then coming in at 13%, folks indicated no challenges. So thank you again for responding to those. The next poll that we asked you, Clay and Debbie listed a number of comments and recommendations from the public comments that are being considered by the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Of these recommendations, please tell us your top recommendation. So 47% indicated access for all, accessible communities was the top priority. Coming in at second place at 20%, increased volunteer driver programs. 13% indicated improved paratransit services. And coming in at fourth place at 7%, folks indicated that training in travel and mobility options was a top priority. So thank you again for responding to those poll questions.
And thank you to all of you who have weighed in today. There are lots of comments and poll results and questions that we will be taking in and sharing with Debbie and Clay to incorporate into the stakeholder recommendations and ultimately the master plan. Lots of concerns about paratransit, lots of opportunities to link with healthcare, lots of, again, the technology without going full Star Trek, as you said, Debbie. Given our time, I want to thank everyone who participated, especially our 4 presenters, but all of you. We had such an incredibly expert and collaborative and interactive and most of all bold group, really calling us to think different, think bigger, and build the Golden California that we know we can do. So thank you so much for that. I would invite you to come back next week. We continue the conversation on poverty, hunger, and homelessness with many superstars. Dr. Margot Cushell from UCSF will be there, as well as leaders from Justice and Aging, St. Mary's Center, and our Housing and Community Service Agency. One quick update, March is changing around as we line up our VIPs. So we will get to the, we will be adding preventing abuse, neglect, and exploitation earlier in March before getting to parks and community spaces and civic and social engagement. For the latest in all the scheduling, you can look at engageca.org. That always has the information. And again, after the presentations, all materials will be there. If you can't be with us in real time, we hope you will follow up. Follow us on Twitter so we can be sure we send you the information, or get on our Engage email blast and we will stay connected. Thank you so much for this inspiring discussion today. Look forward to seeing you next week.